Well, I want to wish everybody, especially the mothers in the group, happy Mother's Day, and those on Zoom, I wish you a happy Mother's Day too. So I bring an assumption to my sermon this morning. Who doesn't bring assumptions to their sermons? Maybe you don't bring assumptions to your sermons, but I bring assumptions to my sermons, and that is that we all had a birth mother, but then there have been other mothering characters in our lives. And so to kind of help me out, I need for you to tell me what you think of as attributes or features or characteristics of good mothering. If you just want to shout them out. Grace? Thank you. That was a new one. Who else? Patience? Nurturing? Caring? A lot of humor, maybe of the sort Billy Collins. You know, when I first read that poem, which was actually at my mother's memorial service, I could barely get through it because I must have given her, over the 4 years I went to camp, dozens of lanyards. I don't know what she did with them. I never saw them again. I never used them. You know, what does one, as Collins says, what does one do with a lanyard? I don't know if any of you have a box of lanyards somewhere where you put them away, that somebody will discover them at some point and wonder what they are. But it was, I think Collins brings an appropriate amount of humor to those. And he also speaks of those mothering features, those mothering characteristics that we might all agree could be considered features of good mothering. I want to speak about some of those this morning, not only with my birth mother, but then with 4 other mothering characters, mothering folks in my life that helped to shape me. And my hope is that it might also prompt you to consider who have been the mothering characters in your life, besides maybe your birth mother, who could have had those qualities and maybe not, and which is why you turn to others. And this isn't necessarily gender neutral. I mean, there's plenty of men who have many mothering features, mothering characteristics that have been important in your life. So just as a way on this Mother's Day to prompt you into thinking, basically, how did you end up being who you are? So let me introduce you to my mother, Charlene Muir, who grew up in a very, very conservative family. She grew up in a Nebraska farming family. They kind of went back and forth between Illinois, Iowa, and Nebraska. And they were very, very conservative Republicans. In fact, one of the stashes we discovered that were in my family was a series of letters between several of my aunts who were all complaining about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and what he was doing about the farmers, and wouldn't we all just be better off if he were no longer president of the United States? They're kind of a hoot to read because they would go between describing the weather and then saying, isn't Roosevelt horrible? And then they would talk about the cows, and then isn't Roosevelt horrible? And they would go back and forth. So my point is, she grew up in this very conservative family. And probably when I was about a senior in high school, or maybe shortly afterwards, and I didn't discover any of this until about a year ago, she had gone to see the movie Godspell. Now, maybe not everybody is familiar with Godspell. You know, in my mind, there were these 3 plays. There was Hair, there was the play Godspell, and then there was Jesus Christ Superstar. They all kind of blend together in my brain as being these very avant-garde, very risky, really pushing the envelope. People didn't like them for a variety of reasons, but my mother went to see the movie Godspell, which I did not see, and she writes that there was one particular line that just really struck her. Evidently, there was a crowd that had gathered around Jesus, and one of the characters shouts, "Jesus, you know I love you. Can't you see I waved? I love you and God. Tell me when I'm saved." Jesus, I love you. Can't you see I waved? I love you and God. Tell me when I'm saved. And the way she interpreted that was, it's not good enough just to wave. If you love your Jesus, in her case, her Jesus, you've got to do more than just wave. If you want her understanding of salvation to be saved, you need to do more than just say you love God and Jesus. In other words, for her, it was, how am I going to walk my talk? How am I going to live into my theology? How am I going to live into what the church and Jesus' teachings say I should be doing? And suddenly there was this transformation in my mother. Something that we never had the opportunity to talk about, because in part, I didn't know all of this was going on until much later. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when she told my father that she was going to begin setting up and protesting at corporate headquarters that had bad business practices in Southeast Asia, which is what this picture is of. Evidently, too, she was motivated by something Jane Addams, the internationally renowned social worker who had established Hull House in Chicago, which is where we lived, and we would frequently go there. And Jane Addams said, nothing could be worse than fear that one is given up too soon and left one effort unexpended, which might have saved the world. Why didn't she tell me this? But there she is out there doing this. She had joined all these state and national organizations. Later, she went to Nicaragua to protest our government's support for the Contras. This is so outside her guardrails. Her parents would have disowned her for this. She made me realize, and she left the lesson for me, that it's never too late to make a difference. She started doing this when she was in her mid-50s, when she no longer had the commitments and the obligations to a home life that she had had before, when she no longer was school teaching. She was a home economics school teacher. Do people still do home economics? I did all the sewing in my family because that's how I learned to sew. All the women went to shop. I mean, it was a very progressive school system, but that's what she taught. It was so in line with the mother that I knew, not this. But for some reason or another, we never had the opportunity to talk about this, nor about how they raised a progressive, liberal, Unitarian Universalist minister, which I know they weren't pleased with. But to me, now it all makes sense. So she left me the lesson, it's never too late to make a difference. That was my birth mother. The second woman to have a mothering impact on me is Anne. Anne was the minister of the Disciples of Christ minister in the church that my family belonged to and that I grew up in. And the thing that struck me about Anne was she was a very nurturing person. And just to give you an example, when I was in middle school, which is when I met Anne first, when I was in middle school, I was not a reader. It's not that I couldn't read, I just didn't like to read. Anne thought everybody should be reading as much as they can possibly read, which is kind of what I do now. I'm just the exact opposite of that. But the way she encouraged me to start reading was she told me for every book I would read, she would bake me a coconut cream pie. I didn't even like coconut cream pie. But there was just something appealing about it. I mean, it was that nurturing, supportive, loving. So the first book she ever gave me was April Morning by Howard Fast. It was only later that I realized that he had been called before the McCarthy House on Activities Committee, that he was a member of the Communist Party. He was this flaming liberal. And yet in April Morning, which is the story of a young boy, which at that time was about my age, and his participation in support of the Revolutionary War in 1775 really caught my imagination and really turned me on to reading. But what impressed me the most about Anne was that she was a person with integrity. She had this constellation of activities that she was involved in. They all hung together like a mobile does on a baby's crib. Do people still use those? Where you would touch one article on the mobile and everything would vibrate because it was all connected. Or maybe we like to talk about a web where each strand is a commitment or a loyalty or a meaning that we have, and you touch one strand of the web and the whole web vibrates. And that was Anne. Everything was connected. Her life was congruent. It was there for everybody to see. This picture was taken about 2 months before she passed away. She was my son's godmother, and it's just kind of striking to see how she is reflected in my son, who also lives, I think, a very congruent, nurturing life. She left me the lesson of integrity, of making sure all the pieces of your life, your loyalties, are connected, and that when you touch one, they all vibrate because they are so connected. This is Kata. She was born in 1928. This picture was taken about 1943 in her hometown, which was in north central Germany. Kata spent most of her middle school years in a bomb shelter because it was shortly after she was born that Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. She was my mother-in-law, and she married my father-in-law, who was a GI, and liberated the town that she lived in. Liberated. She said, they did their fair share, and he says they didn't do anything, which they would always argue about when I would come. But she would often tell this story that they spent so much time in bomb shelters that one night they were told they could go back home. And she said it was just so luxurious to get back in her own bed with clean sheets and knowing that she was going to have a night's sleep without being interfered. And no sooner had she gotten into bed than the air raid sirens went off, and she was just so angry. She was just so angry, and she got up and she went to the window and she opened up the window, and she says she could see the planes coming. And she picked up a hairbrush and she just shook the hairbrush at the planes that were coming. And then she was so angry, she threw her hairbrush at the planes and then proceeded to get down on her knees laughing. Because she knew not only was she not going to have a good night's sleep, but she had just lost her only hairbrush. It was very difficult to talk to her without some way or another ending up talking about World War II, because it had made such an impression on her life. And on her deathbed, she told her 3 daughters to never stop telling the stories she had told them. One of which was, when she came to this country, she immediately got involved in politics because she was terrified that Americans didn't understand how an authoritarian regime easily takes over. And she would tell her friends, and every door she would knock on who would recognize her accent, that it can happen here too. You think just because we live in a democratic society that you can't be taken over by an authoritarian regime, because it can happen. And no sooner do you start thinking that way than it can happen. So she left me the lesson of telling stories that are much larger than myself and having the courage to share those with other people. She was a very brave woman. When Karen and I moved from Indianapolis to Indiana, which is where I'd gone to school, I went to seminary in New York City, and when we moved to New York City, we knew nobody. Eventually we met students. Some of those students, ironically, were in Godspell at seminary, but we didn't know anybody else, and so we were quite lonely. And then we remembered that we had some friends from college who lived on the North Shore of Long Island, in Oyster Bay, if you know Long Island at all. They were both doctors, and their children were out of the house. And I think they really wanted some younger people in the house, so they kind of adopted us as their children, and we adopted them as our parents. And this is a picture of Marjorie, who is in the center. You notice there's 3 women. Now, you may look at this picture and go, oh my goodness, there's 3 women. You could also say, oh my goodness, there's 3 women. 1947, this is a residency cohort at a New York City hospital. I was talking to several of the doctors at the first service who they said in 1947, you really didn't see that many women as part of a cohort of people studying to become pathologists. She had a specialty. And so we would go out to Oyster Bay frequently, and I got to know Marjorie quite well, who ended up being my daughter's godmother. And the similarities are remarkable, because one of the things that Marjorie taught me was how to be a professional. She had definite guardrails between her work, her family, and her faith. She raised 4 children. She was I want to say world-class pathologist, but I don't know a lot about pathology. She was also a major sustainer of the New York City blood bank system. She was a really remarkable woman. And so she modeled for me how to set up guardrails, how to be both a professional and a person devoted to family and to my marriage. And I loved her to the moon and back for all of that. She really showed me how to do it. Now, for those of you who have been here since 1983, which is when my family moved to Annapolis, this is Esther. Esther, when I moved here, there were 2 matriarch wannabes, and then there was 1 matriarch. A matriarch is like the mother of an institution. And usually you can become a matriarch. Sometimes matriarchs get bad names because they do nasty things. They're gatekeepers, and they tell stories and rumors. They help foster rumors about people. Esther, to my knowledge, didn't do any of that. Esther was in the blood of this congregation. It's because of Esther that we have this row of hemlocks out here. She bought them all, planted them all, and on the way home she had $1.50 left over, and she bought a magnolia seedling, which has been out here growing for the last 50 or 60 years. The entire deck, the entire wing of that church was all built around magnolia. Esther's fingerprints are all over this church. 2 generations of remodeling ago, every chair in this room was orange, Esther's favorite color. The paneling in this room wasn't orange, but it was pretty close to being orange. You know, then they became brown, then they became, what are these, teal? Esther and I didn't get along initially. She was very committed to my predecessor, which seems like ancient history because he was here 20 years. He came in like 1968, maybe even earlier than that. And so here I was, a minister out of Maine, from this little teeny church in Maine. I was 33 years old. All Esther wanted to do was tell me about the way Bill had done everything and what a wonderful minister he was. And I knew that I had finally won over Esther when at my 10th anniversary party that the congregation had thrown, she pulled me aside at the end and she whispered to me, "Fred, I want you to know you are my minister. And when I pass away, I want you to do my service." And it was like, I've arrived. The matriarch has given me her approval. And we had a good 20 years after that. Esther, in spite of all the challenges we had with each other, Esther stayed at the table. She was generous with her wealth, with her time, with her opinions. She stayed at the table. She was a faithful sustainer. She was my Emersonian pagan. And when you walk around all of the grounds, you see Esther. So you met my birth mother, you met the other 4 mothering characters in my life, and the lessons they left me were how to make a difference, regardless of how old you are. It's never too late to make a difference. How to model, how to live a life of integrity, how to be a faithful sustainer, stay at the table, and to have the courage to tell your story. Have the courage to tell your story. So who are the mothering characters in your life? And what are the lessons they left for you? And how do you speak of them and about them? Amen.